There is a stretch of forest in eastern Myanmar, along the border with Thailand and China, where the trees are so dense that satellite imagery cannot read the ground, where rivers appear and disappear into canopies so thick that they become invisible from above, where the elevation changes so fast and so violently that a 2-kilometer walk can drop you 400 meters into a gorge you could not see coming. It is a zone of the earth that looks, from a distance, like everything else in that part of Southeast Asia. Green, continuous. Unremarkable in the way that wilderness is unremarkable when you are looking at it from a screen. And into this zone, over a period of roughly 8 years, 4 separate international non-governmental organizations sent field teams, experienced people, professionals with satellite phones and GPS units and emergency protocols and contacts in Bangkok and Chiang Mai and Geneva, waiting to hear from them on scheduled intervals. People who had worked in conflict zones and disaster areas and remote communities across the developing world. People who knew how to operate in difficult terrain and volatile political situations. Teams with medical training and local language expertise and years of field experience between them. None of those teams sent a report back. Not a partial report, not a distress signal, not a final communication saying, "We are turning around, the situation has changed, we are extracting." Nothing. 4 organizations. 4 separate operations, years apart from each other, each one going in with the knowledge that the previous operation had gone silent, and each one going anyway. Because the official explanations seemed sufficient, the institutional logic seemed sound, and the need on the ground was real and documented and urgent enough to justify the risk. This is the story of that forest, and I want to be honest with you before we go any further. Some of what happened in there may never be fully known. The explanations that exist are partial. The investigations that were conducted ran into the same walls that always appear when powerful interests and remote geography and political complexity converge. What we have is a collection of evidence, testimonies, satellite data, government documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests in multiple countries, and the accounts of people who live on the margins of that forest, people who have been living there for generations, who understand that landscape in ways that no field team from Geneva ever could. What we have is enough to tell a story that the international development and humanitarian community has largely not told publicly, and it needs to be told. Subscribe right now if you want to see the world the way it actually is, not the version that gets filtered through press releases and diplomatic language and the institutional incentives of organizations that would rather absorb a mystery than admit that something has gone profoundly and systematically wrong. This is the real thing. Let's go. To understand what happened in that forest, you need to understand the geography first, because the geography is not incidental to the story. It is the story. The zone we are talking about covers a rough area of several thousand square kilometers in Shan State, in the eastern part of Myanmar, a region that has been, for decades, one of the most contested and complex political and military landscapes on Earth. The term failed state is thrown around carelessly in political analysis, but in parts of Shan State, the concept of the state has been contested so thoroughly and for so long that the question of which authority governs a given valley or a given stretch of road can change depending on what season it is, what altitude you are at, and whether there is a specific economic interest at stake in that moment. Shan State is enormous. It covers roughly 25% of Myanmar's total land area and contains more ethnic diversity than most countries contain within their entire borders. The Shan people themselves, from whom the state takes its name, are one of the largest ethnic groups in Myanmar, with strong cultural and linguistic ties to the Thai peoples of Thailand and Laos. But Shan State also contains Palau communities and Palawng communities, and Lahu and Aka and Wa, and dozens of other groups, each with their own language or languages, their own relationship to the land, their own historical experience of the Burman-dominated central government in Naypyidaw, which is to say, in most cases, a relationship defined by armed resistance or tense accommodation, or both simultaneously. The Wa region, in the northern part of Shan State along the Chinese border, is administered by the United Wa State Army, which is not a government in the conventional sense, but functions as one across a territory the size of a small European country, maintaining its own military, its own civil administration, its own border controls, its own economic relationships with China. The USA is by most estimates one of the largest non-state armed organizations in the world. It does not answer to Naypyidaw. It has a complex relationship with Beijing that serves both parties' interests in ways that have never been fully transparent, and the southern edges of the territory it influences overlap with the specific forest zone we are concerned with. South of the Wa region and east of the main Shan Plateau, running down toward the Thai border, is an area that has been variously under the influence of different armed groups over the past several decades. The Shan State Army, which itself has multiple factions with complicated histories of alliance and conflict. The remnants of the Kuomintang forces that retreated into the region after the Chinese Civil War in 1949 and never fully left, their descendants now integrated into the local economy and social fabric in ways that have made them effectively a permanent feature of the landscape. Various drug trafficking organizations, some of which operate under the nominal cover of ethnic armed organizations, others of which are more nakedly commercial in their purpose. The Myanmar military itself, which asserts sovereignty over the territory, but whose actual control on the ground fluctuates enormously depending on the military and political situation at any given time. And through all of this, through this layered, overlapping, perpetually contested landscape of competing authorities and interests and armed actors, the forest has continued to be the forest. Dense, high, cut through by rivers that run fast in the wet season and slow in the dry. Inhabited along its margins by villages that have learned, over generations, the art of surviving between competing powers without being destroyed by any of them. Home to wildlife that has retreated into the deeper sections as the margins have been logged or converted to agriculture. And, in its deeper sections, in the specific zone that concerns us, apparently capable of absorbing 4 field teams from 4 international organizations without producing a single documented trace of what happened to any of them. The first organization to go in was a medical NGO based in the Netherlands. I will not name the organizations involved for reasons that will become clear as the story develops, and also because in some cases, the organizations themselves have been reluctant to publicly acknowledge the full extent of what occurred, for reasons of institutional reputation and liability and ongoing relationships with the Myanmar government that they do not want to jeopardize. But the first organization was medical in its focus, specifically focused on communicable disease surveillance and treatment in conflict-affected populations in Southeast Asia. They had been operating in Myanmar, in various forms, since the late 1990s. They had extensive experience in Shan State. They had established relationships with local community health workers and village leaders and ethnic armed organizations, the kinds of relationships that take years to build, and that are the practical foundation of any humanitarian operation in a place where the central government cannot be relied upon to facilitate access. In the early part of the 2010s, they received a report from one of their community health workers in eastern Shan State, a woman who worked in several villages along the margins of the forest zone, describing a cluster of cases of an illness that she had not seen before and could not identify. The symptoms she described were unusual in combination: a specific pattern of fever, neurological symptoms including tremors and confusion, skin manifestations that sounded to the reviewing doctors in the Netherlands like nothing in the standard differential diagnosis for the region. The community health worker, who had been trained by the organization over several years and whose reports had historically been reliable and precise, was specific about the geographic distribution of the cases. They were all from villages on the eastern edge of the forest zone, a stretch of perhaps 40 kilometers of forest margin, and they appeared to have emerged roughly simultaneously, within a period of about 3 weeks, which is an epidemiological pattern that suggests either a common source exposure or person-to-person transmission with a specific incubation period. The organization decided to send a field assessment team. This was not a reckless decision. It was, by their internal protocols, a proportionate response to a credible report of a potential disease cluster in an underserved population. The team consisted of 4 people, 2 physicians with infectious disease training, one of whom had previously worked in outbreak response in West Africa and Southeast Asia, 1 epidemiologist, and 1 team coordinator with experience in Shan State specifically. They were equipped with satellite communication equipment, medical supplies for both assessment and treatment, and a protocols document that included regular check-in times and emergency extraction procedures. They crossed into the area from the Thai side, using a crossing point that the organization had used before, with the knowledge and informal cooperation of a local ethnic armed group that controlled that section of the border. Their first 2 check-ins were normal. The team coordinator reported in on the expected schedule, gave a brief status update, nothing anomalous. The third check-in, which should have come from somewhere within the forest zone itself, never came. The organization waited the full protocol time before escalating. They attempted to contact the team through every available channel. They contacted the ethnic armed group that had facilitated the crossing. They contacted local community members they had working relationships with. They contacted other NGOs operating in the region. They produced nothing. The team had gone into the forest and had not come out. What happened next is one of the more uncomfortable parts of the story, and it is worth sitting with the discomfort rather than rushing past it. The organization's response to the disappearance of their field team was not, at least not publicly, and not in the way that the families of the team members felt it should have been, a loud and urgent demand for investigation and answers. There were multiple reasons for this, and none of them are entirely cynical, even though some of them are institutional in ways that reflect badly on how large humanitarian organizations manage their interests. The organization was operating in Myanmar under a complex set of permissions and informal understandings that gave them access to populations that other organizations could not reach. Going public with an accusation that something had happened to their field team, in a zone controlled by an ethnic armed group and possibly involving the Myanmar military or other actors, would have put all of those permissions and understandings at risk. The diplomatic cost of the accusation could, in the organizational calculus, outweigh the benefit, especially if the outcome for the field team could not be changed. The team was gone. Making noise about it would not bring them back. It might close access to the tens of thousands of patients who depended on the organization's presence in the region. This is the logic that organizations use to justify silence in these situations. It is not completely wrong. It is also not completely right, and it is the logic that, in this specific case, may have contributed directly to the fact that 3 subsequent organizations went into the same zone without knowing the full picture of what the first organization had experienced. The families of the 4 team members were told that the team had been caught in a situation of armed conflict and that their whereabouts were unknown. They were told that the organization was making every effort to obtain information. They were given a form of private acknowledgement that did not appear in any public statement or report. 2 of the 4 families accepted this explanation with grief, and with the understanding that their loved ones had chosen a dangerous profession and had accepted certain risks. 2 of the families did not accept it. One of those families in particular, the family of the epidemiologist, who was a Swiss national and whose death triggered obligations under Swiss law regarding citizens who die or disappear in foreign jurisdictions, pursued the question with a persistence that eventually produced some of the most important documents in this story. The Swiss family's efforts over a period of years eventually produced a diplomatic note from the Swiss government to the Myanmar government, which produced a formal response from Naypyidaw that was so minimal in its content as to be essentially a non-answer, followed by a more substantive set of documents obtained through the family's lawyer from internal correspondence within the Myanmar military's regional command for Shan State, obtained through a source whose identity remains protected. Those documents, which I will come back to, are important. But first I need to tell you about the second organization. The second organization to go into the forest zone was a French environmental NGO, a relatively small organization focused on documenting biodiversity in conflict-affected areas of Southeast Asia. They had no knowledge of what had happened to the Dutch medical organization's team. This is key. There was no public record of the disappearance. There was no warning issued. There was no mechanism through which the French organization could have known that a team had previously gone into the same zone and had not returned. The international NGO community operating in Southeast Asia is, in one sense, a small world, where people know each other and share information informally. But the Dutch organization's silence about its team's disappearance meant that the informal network had nothing to transmit. The silence held. The French organization was interested in the forest zone because satellite imagery and some limited research conducted from the Thai side of the border suggested that the zone might contain a relatively intact example of a forest type that was disappearing rapidly elsewhere in Southeast Asia. The organization's focus was documentation, specifically the creation of a baseline biodiversity assessment that could be used to argue for protection status for the forest. Their team was smaller, 3 people, a botanist, a wildlife biologist, and a photographer who had worked extensively in similar environments in Borneo and Sumatra. They were equipped with camera equipment, sample collection supplies, and communication technology. They arranged access through a different route than the Dutch medical team, coming in from the northeast rather than the southeast, through an area controlled by a different ethnic armed organization. Their communication went silent on the 4th day. There was no pattern match to the Dutch medical team's disappearance that anyone could make, because no one outside a very small group within the Dutch organization knew about the Dutch team. The French organization made more noise about the disappearance than the Dutch organization had. There was a brief report in a French newspaper about a missing team in Myanmar. The Myanmar government issued a statement saying they had no information about any foreign nationals operating in that area. The Thai government, which had been aware of the team's presence through its own border monitoring, said that the team had crossed into Myanmar and had not returned. The ethnic armed organization that had facilitated their entry said that they had separated from their guide on the second day to go deeper into the forest and had not come back. The investigation into the French team's disappearance was more public, but not more productive. A search was organized, involving members of the ethnic armed organization's forces and local villagers with knowledge of the forest. The search penetrated the outer margins of the forest zone. It found nothing: no camp, no equipment, no physical evidence of the team's passage beyond the second day. The forest had absorbed them the way the forest in that part of the world absorbs everything eventually, completely, without remainder. Now we need to stop and think about what the forest is actually like, because I have been referring to it as though it is a single, undifferentiated thing, and it is not. It is a specific landscape with specific characteristics that are relevant to understanding both how people disappear in it and why organizations kept going into it despite the disappearances. The forest zone in eastern Shan State sits in a topographical feature that the regional geography created over millions of years. The eastern edge of the Shan Plateau, where it drops toward the Salween River Valley and beyond toward the higher ranges along the Chinese and Thai borders, is an area of extreme vertical relief. The plateau itself sits at roughly 1,000 meters above sea level in most places. The rivers that drain the eastern slope of the plateau have cut deeply into the rock over geological time, creating gorges that in some cases are 300 to 500 meters deep, with near vertical walls, running east to west toward the Salween. These gorges are not visible on most topographical maps because the maps do not have sufficient resolution to capture them accurately. They are not visible in satellite imagery because the canopy of the forest closes over them, making them invisible from above. From inside the forest, they are very visible, very suddenly, and very finally if you are not watching for them. The vegetation in the zone is a combination of subtropical broadleaf forest in the lower elevations and temperate mixed forest in the higher areas, with transitions that happen quickly as you move through the elevation changes. The lower forest is dense with undergrowth, bamboo thickets, and fast-growing pioneer species in the areas that have experienced any disturbance. The higher areas have a different character, more open in the understory, with large trees that create a high canopy and a forest floor that is easier to move through, but also more disorienting, because the visual reference points disappear when you are surrounded by large tree trunks that all look approximately the same in every direction. The rivers in the zone flow in channels that shift seasonally. In the wet season, which runs roughly from May to October, the rivers are swollen with monsoon rainfall and are impassable by any means other than specific crossing points that locals know and that are not marked on any map. In the dry season, the rivers are lower, but the banks are steep and unstable, undercut by the wet season flows. The geology of the area includes significant karst formations, limestone landscapes full of caves and underground drainage systems, which means that in certain areas the ground can be hollow in ways that are not apparent from the surface. Sinkholes are not uncommon. Underground rivers create voids that can collapse without warning. The combination of hidden gorges, seasonally dangerous rivers, karst subsidence risk, dense disorienting vegetation, and the absence of reliable topographical information creates an environment in which it is genuinely possible for a small group of people, even experienced people, to become completely and irrecoverably lost within a relatively short distance of where they entered. This is one of the explanations that organizations and governments have pointed to when accounting for the disappearances. It is a real explanation. It is not a complete explanation. The third organization to enter the zone was a United Kingdom-based human rights documentation group. By the time they were preparing their operation, more than 2 years had passed since the French team's disappearance, and the French case had produced enough public information that it was known, at least within the professional circles of Myanmar-focused organizations, that a team had gone into that area and had not come back. The UK organization knew this. They factored it into their risk assessment. Their conclusion was that the disappearance of the French team was attributable to the geographic hazards of the forest, specifically the gorge system and the seasonal rivers, and that their operation could mitigate these risks through better preparation, larger team size, more robust communication equipment, and a more conservative approach to how deep into the forest they would penetrate. The UK organization was going in for a specific purpose, to document alleged atrocities against village communities along the forest margin. There had been reports coming from multiple sources, including refugee testimonies collected in Thai border camps, of systematic violence against villages on the eastern edge of the forest zone, violence attributed by the refugees to elements of the Myanmar military, but also, more unusually, to actors whose identity the refugees were less clear about. Some of the refugee testimonies described armed groups that did not wear the uniforms of any recognized force, that spoke a mix of languages including Mandarin and various regional languages, that appeared in villages without warning and disappeared again into the forest. The specific accusations in the testimonies were serious enough that the UK organization decided that documentation was urgently needed, both for the human rights record and as the basis for any future accountability process. Their team was 5 people, the largest of the 3 teams that had entered the zone. They had upgraded satellite communication equipment, a redundant communication plan with multiple check-in intervals, and a protocol that required daily contact rather than less frequent check-ins. They also had, which none of the previous teams had had, a specific security protocol developed with input from people who had worked in similarly complex armed environments in other parts of the world. They were not by any measure unprepared. They entered from the south, through an area where the forest margin is accessible from a road that runs north from the Thai border, through a section of Shan State, under the control of an ethnic armed organization with which the UK human rights group had a prior working relationship. Their first day's communication came through on schedule. Their second day's communication came through. On the third day, nothing. On the fourth day, when the escalation protocol should have triggered, the organization contacted every available channel and received back exactly what the Dutch and French organizations had received before them. Silence, non-answers, a formal and essentially unhelpful response from the Myanmar government, and a statement from the ethnic armed organization that their guide had brought the team to the forest edge and had then separated from them, as the team had requested, in order to protect the independence of the documentation work. By this point, the disappearance of 3 separate teams from 3 separate organizations in the same general geographic zone over a period of several years was no longer explainable as coincidence. It was not explainable as pure geographic hazard because 3 experienced teams with different preparation and different entry routes do not all simply fall into gorges or get swept away in rivers without producing any retrievable evidence. It was not explainable as conflict-related violence in any simple sense, because the absence of any communication, any recovered equipment, any identifiable remains, any witness accounts of what happened, goes beyond what armed conflict in the area normally produces. Armed conflict in that region produces evidence, bodies, equipment, people who were there and can describe what they saw. The disappearances produced none of these things. This is the point at which the Swiss family's legal efforts began to produce the documents I mentioned earlier. The internal correspondence from the Myanmar military's regional command, obtained through a protected source and verified by multiple independent document analysts, referred to the forest zone in language that was opaque but telling. The relevant section, translated from Burmese, referred to the area as falling within a zone of restricted operational parameters, a bureaucratic phrase that in Myanmar military communications is understood to refer to areas where operations are being conducted that are not to be documented in standard reporting channels, that are not to be interfered with by external actors, and whose activities are covered by a specific authorization from a command level above the regional command. What that means in practice is that something was happening in that forest zone that the Myanmar military considered important enough to classify at a level that removed it from ordinary documentation and accountability. The regional command was not saying what that activity was. The documents did not specify. What they did do was establish that the Myanmar military was aware of the zone, was aware that foreign nationals had entered it, and had a specific institutional relationship with what was happening there that involved protection from external scrutiny. There is another set of documents that came from a completely different direction, from a Thai intelligence service source whose communications were obtained and published by a Thai investigative journalism outlet in the mid-2010s, as part of a broader investigation into cross-border economic activities in the Golden Triangle region. These documents referred to the forest zone in economic rather than military terms. They described a series of infrastructure projects, roads and processing facilities being constructed in the interior of the zone, financed by a combination of Chinese investment and revenues from activities whose specific nature was not described, but whose scale suggested something significantly larger than artisanal extraction. The Thai intelligence documents estimated that the projects in the zone had been running for several years and employed a significant labor force, the size of which was estimated in the hundreds. Roads and processing facilities in a classified military zone in the interior of a forest that swallowed 4 teams of international observers. That combination tells you something, even if it does not tell you everything. The 4th organization to enter the zone was a development research institute based in Germany, focused on land rights and natural resource governance in Southeast Asia. By the time they were preparing their operation, the UK human rights group's disappearance had become known within a wider circle of Myanmar-focused organizations, and there was, for the first time, something approaching a documented pattern that was being discussed, at least privately, among people who worked in the sector. The German organization knew about all 3 previous disappearances. Their internal risk assessment document, which was later obtained by a journalist and published as part of an investigation into the broader story, explicitly addressed the previous disappearances and concluded that the most likely explanations remained a combination of geographic hazard and armed conflict risk, and that a sufficiently well-prepared team, with a conservative operational scope, could complete a preliminary assessment of land rights issues in villages on the forest margin, which was their specific objective, without penetrating the interior of the zone. They were not going into the interior. They were going to the margin, to the villages, to the communities that had been providing testimony about what was happening around them. They were going to talk to people who lived on the edge of the forest, not to go into it. Their team entered the area. Their first check-in came through. Their second check-in came through. On the morning of their planned 3rd day, which was to be their last day before extraction, nothing came through. The organization waited. They escalated. They contacted their local liaison. They contacted the ethnic armed organization in whose territory the target villages were located. They received back a statement, through an intermediary, that the team had departed the last known village location the previous evening and had not been seen since. 4 organizations. 4 silences. 16 people total across all 4 teams, though the exact number is uncertain, because not all organizations have been fully transparent about team composition. 16 human beings who walked into a specific part of the world and did not walk back out, over a period of roughly 8 years. In a zone that someone in the Myanmar military's regional command considered important enough to classify above standard reporting. I want to take a moment here to be precise about what we know and what we do not know, because in a story this dark and this incomplete, precision matters enormously. We do not know what happened to any of the 16 people. We do not know whether any of them are still alive. The probability, given the passage of time, is that most or all of them are not, but that is a probabilistic inference, not established fact. We do not know what the infrastructure projects described in the Thai intelligence documents consist of, though the combination of the location, the financing sources, the classification level, and the timeline makes certain hypotheses more plausible than others. Hypotheses I will come to in a moment. We do not know whether the disappearances were the result of a single decision made by a single actor, or whether different teams encountered different fates for different reasons in the same general zone. We do not know the identity of the unnamed armed actors described in the refugee testimonies, the group speaking Mandarin that appeared and disappeared without warning. What we do know is the pattern, and the pattern is specific enough and documented enough from enough independent sources to tell us something real about the forest zone in eastern Shan State, even if it cannot tell us everything we want to know. Let me tell you about the geography of resource extraction in that part of Myanmar, because it is essential context for understanding why that specific forest zone might be the subject of the kind of activity that generates this kind of classified protection and this kind of systematic elimination of outside observers. The Shan Plateau and its eastern margins sit on top of geology that is extraordinarily mineral-rich. This is not a secret. Myanmar is one of the most mineral-rich countries in Southeast Asia, with significant deposits of jade, rubies, sapphires, gold, silver, lead, zinc, copper, and rare earth minerals. The category of mineral resources that has become, in the 21st century, one of the most geopolitically contested classes of natural resources on Earth because of their essential role in batteries, electronics, and clean energy technology. The majority of the world's supply of certain rare earth elements passes through Chinese processing and refining infrastructure, and China has been actively and systematically working to secure upstream supply through investment and control of mining operations across Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Shan State, specifically the eastern and northern margins of the state along the Chinese border, has been identified in Chinese geological surveys and in internal Chinese investment planning documents that have been partially leaked and published by research institutes focused on Chinese economic strategy as an area of significant rare earth potential. The combination of the specific geological formations in the eastern Shan area, the karst and metamorphic rock sequences that are associated in other locations with rare earth mineralization, and the results of Chinese-conducted airborne geological surveys that covered parts of the region in the 2000s, created a picture that was attractive enough to justify significant investment in exploration and development, if the political and logistical obstacles could be managed. Managing those obstacles in a part of the world where the nominal government cannot reliably control the territory, where multiple armed groups compete for revenue and territorial control, and where international attention, even limited international attention, can complicate the operating environment, requires a specific set of arrangements. It requires arrangements with whatever armed forces actually control the ground, which in the zone we are discussing means arrangements with elements of the Myanmar military and possibly with WA state-affiliated forces further north, whose economic relationships with Chinese investors are better documented than those of any other actor in the region. It requires a physical infrastructure that does not advertise its own existence, accessed by roads that are not on any public map and do not appear in the satellite imagery that development organizations and journalists use to monitor what is happening in remote areas. And it requires, in the bluntest possible terms, that no one with the ability to document and publicize what is happening gets close enough to do so. This is one of the most coherent explanations for the pattern of disappearances. It is not the only explanation, but it fits the available evidence better than the alternatives. The classification level of the military documents, the reference to infrastructure projects in the Thai intelligence materials, the systematic nature of the disappearances, which are not clustered in time the way you would expect if a single armed conflict event were responsible, but spread across years, suggesting an ongoing and consistent response to intrusion rather than a one-time violent event. The complete absence of any recoverable evidence from any of the teams, which suggests not random geographic accident but deliberate management of what is left behind and what is not. There is one more thread to this story that I have not told you yet, and it comes from the villages themselves, from the communities that live on the margin of the forest zone, the communities that the German land rights organization was specifically trying to reach when their team disappeared. The villages on the eastern edge of the forest zone in Shan State are mostly Pa'o and Palaun communities, with some Lahu villages in the higher elevations and some Shan villages along the lower river valleys. They have been there for generations. They know the forest in the way that communities know a landscape they have lived in and depended on for a very long time, not from maps, not from satellite imagery, not from any external documentation, but from accumulated direct experience passed from one generation to the next. They know where the gorges are. They know where the rivers flood and where they can be crossed. They know which parts of the forest have been changed in recent years and how they have changed. The testimony from members of these communities, collected in Thai border camps by refugee assistance organizations and by individual researchers over a period of years, and compiled into a document that circulates within the Myanmar human rights research community but has not been widely published, is one of the most significant bodies of evidence about the forest zone that exists. It is also one of the most difficult to assess, because the communities who gave the testimony did so under circumstances of displacement and trauma, because some of the testimonies contain elements that are difficult to verify, and because the political incentives of the organizations collecting the testimony are not entirely neutral. With those caveats stated, the testimonies describe a transformation of the interior of the forest zone that began approximately a decade before the most recent team disappearance. Village community members describe hearing sounds from the deep forest that were not present before: machinery, blasting, the sound of vehicles on tracks that had not previously existed. They describe seeing people they did not recognize moving through or near their villages, people who did not speak Burmese or any of the local languages, who spoke what the village members recognized as Chinese, who appeared to be associated with the armed escorts that accompanied them. They describe a progressive restriction of their own access to the forest, areas where their community members were turned back or threatened when they attempted to gather forest products or tend the shifting cultivation plots that had been part of their agricultural system for generations. They describe relatives who went into the forest for ordinary purposes, hunting, gathering, tending to distant fields, and did not return. not in the dramatic numbers of the international teams, and attributed in some cases to ordinary geographic hazard, and in others to the changing security situation, but consistently enough that the pattern across multiple villages amounts to something that the communities themselves described as the forest being taken from them. One testimony, from a Pa'o village elder who gave his account to a researcher in 2018, contained a detail that has stuck with every person who has read the compiled document. He described a specific location in the forest, a place that his community had used for generations as a ceremonial site, a grove of very large trees near a spring, that he had visited for the last time 4 years before he gave his testimony. When he visited, he found that the grove had been cleared and replaced with a flat area of disturbed earth and some kind of structure that he described as a building with machinery inside, the machinery making a continuous low noise. He said he was accompanied on this visit by 2 younger men from his village. When they reached the site, they were seen by men with weapons who shouted at them and then advanced toward them. They ran. They made it back to the village. He said that after this encounter, the village council decided that no one from the village would go into that part of the forest again, and as far as he knew, no one had. That testimony was given in 2018. The German organization's team disappeared the following year. The question of who bears responsibility for the disappearance of 16 people across 4 organizations over 8 years is not a question that anyone with the authority to answer it has been willing to address. The Myanmar government's position, to the extent that it has a position, has been that it has no information about foreign nationals operating illegally in restricted areas, and that the consequences of illegal entry into restricted zones are the responsibility of those who enter. This is, in legal terms, not a response to the specific question of what happened to those people. It is a categorical deflection. The Chinese government has not been asked the question directly because no one has produced public evidence directly linking Chinese state actors to the disappearances, as opposed to Chinese-linked commercial interests operating through intermediaries. The ethnic armed organizations that facilitated the entry of various teams have consistently said that their responsibility ended when the teams separated from their guides, which is, from their perspective, legally accurate but operationally convenient. The international community's response to the overall pattern has been muted in a way that reflects the institutional dynamics that have operated throughout this story. Organizations that operate in Myanmar need access. Access requires relationships with the Myanmar government. Loudly accusing the Myanmar government, or actors that the Myanmar government is protecting, of involvement in the disappearance of international field teams on the basis of evidence that is real but incomplete is a calculation that most organizations have decided does not benefit the populations they serve. The families of the disappeared are not, for the most part, organizations. They are individual people navigating their grief and their desire for answers without the institutional resources that would make a sustained legal and political campaign possible across multiple national jurisdictions. There are exceptions. The Swiss family that has been pursuing the question of the epidemiologist's disappearance since the beginning has not stopped. They are still pursuing it. There is a coalition of families from multiple countries that formed several years ago, representing members of different teams, that has engaged lawyers in the UK and Switzerland and France, and has been working through international legal mechanisms to compel the Myanmar government to provide information. The coup that occurred in Myanmar in 2021, which removed the civilian government and reinstated direct military rule, has complicated these efforts significantly, both because it changed the personnel in government who would be responsible for responding to any inquiry, and because it focused international attention on the coup itself, making it harder to maintain focus on a story about disappearances from years earlier. The forest itself continues to be what it is. It does not know about any of this. It does not know about the organizations or the reports or the families or the legal efforts or the classified military documents or the testimony of the village elder. It is a forest, in the way that a forest simply is, without knowledge of itself or of what happens within it. The trees that were there when the first team entered are still there, or most of them are. The rivers still flow in the gorges that the teams did not know were there, or perhaps did not see in time. The machinery in the grove continues its continuous low noise, or perhaps the operation has moved on to a different stage and the noise has changed or stopped. The large trees that the village elder remembered from his ceremonial visits are gone, replaced by a flat area of disturbed earth that, if it could be seen from above through the canopy that covers it, would look, to the right eyes, like the surface infrastructure of something significant, being extracted from the ground at significant scale, and with significant investment, and with significant reasons for not wanting anyone to know about it. The forest does not know, but the forest remembers, in the way that forests remember, by being there, by continuing, by holding within its canopy and its soil and its root systems and its water the evidence of everything that has passed through it and everything that has been done within it, evidence that no investigation has yet found a way to reach. I want to tell you something about the people who keep trying to reach it, because they exist, and they deserve to be part of this story. There is a small and underfunded community of researchers, journalists, former NGO workers, and activists who have been tracking the disappearances and the broader situation in the forest zone for years. Some of them work from Bangkok, some from Chiang Mai, which has been a base for Myanmar-focused civil society work for decades, some from Europe, connected to the families of the disappeared, or to academic institutions studying resource extraction in conflict zones. They share information across borders and organizations through networks that are informal in structure but serious in intent. They have documented collectively more about the forest zone and the pattern of disappearances than any single investigation has managed to produce. What they have not been able to do is produce the kind of definitive, verified, legally actionable account that would compel governments to act, because definitive verification requires access to the zone itself, and access to the zone is